Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Gas Resource Management Stakeholder Call to discuss the issue paper. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Today's slide deck presentation is available on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, and then under the Stakeholder Center tab on the home page, you'll see policy initiatives. If you click that link, it'll take you to our main initiative landing page where you can then search for the initiative webpage. This meeting is being recorded and the video file will be posted to the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need any technical assistance at any point during the meeting today, please send a chat to Inteller Events, the host. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right, and then you can raise your hand by selecting the raised hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And for everyone joining us, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking, and you can also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sylvie to get us started.
Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Gas Resource Management. It's been a while since we last met, but we gave you a lot of homework to do with the issue paper and a lot more homework to do with the comment template. So today's stakeholder call is a bit different than the normal issue paper call. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the issues, which is what we did during the working group process. Instead, today, my goal is really to make sure that you understand how to use the issue paper as a resource when you're preparing your comments, and that you understand the feedback that we're asking for and why. And you may have noted that we already published, or we already put out the comment template. So you're welcome to pull that up, flip through it, so you can ask questions now. And those comments will be due March 11th. So a high-level look at what the issue paper looks like. There's two features that I want to point out. First, section 3 is called Reader's Guide, and this is intended for you to use as a roadmap and a reference guide. You can flip through it and see where the issues you brought up are, and it points to the specific sections. Section 3.1, I think, is particularly important. It establishes shorthand that I use throughout the rest of the paper. And then sections 4 through 7 are issue specific for policy development. And throughout the paper, each section has these call outs with little arrows so that you can more easily find the prompts that are associated with the comment template we just put out. We did that because it's a really long paper, so you might want to just hunt down the things that you need, and that makes it easier to do that. This round of feedback is really it's to refine scope and prioritization of policy development for the next year, because we got a ton of feedback already through the working group process. And if we went straight to a straw proposal, we realized it would be 400 pages long. So this is to help us narrow the scope of what's happening next. So let's go to the next slide. Great. So today we're going to go over the tentative schedule for policy development for the rest of the year. And I'll touch on each of the issues and the issue paper sections, review some key concepts, and then mostly focus on IT and implementation feedback to inform the feasibility of different stakeholder suggestions. And then you can take the ball with any trade-offs around policy that you'd like to discuss. I'm also going to highlight specific areas where the ISO is currently seeking feedback, and we'll pause for some discussion. But mostly I want to make sure that you understand the feedback that we're looking for and where that's going to be applied. Finally, I've already got some next steps to address feedback to date, so I'll review those and hear any additional recommendations. There is an appendix with some more background and lower priority discussion items if they come up or if we have time at the end. Let's go to the next slide. This is our tentative schedule for the next year. It's February right now, so we put the paper out in January. Stakeholder call. Comments will be due in March. And then given the breadth of potential action items on the table, we're going to take a beat between the comment deadline and the straw proposal to debrief on that feedback and get alignment in a working group on what we want to focus our efforts on and what might be scoped out for now. We'll put out a straw proposal aiming for Q2 that will be followed by a couple of more specific working groups to consider proposals and analysis, and aiming for a draft final proposal and target board decision by the end of the year. Any questions so far?
I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So before jumping in, we put this graphic in the issue paper just to get aligned on the acronyms and the process and how both the gas and electric market timelines relate. So I'm going to go through this because I'll continue to use these acronyms throughout today's call. Every day, there is a day-ahead market process. The day-ahead market process that happens on DA2, that top line, which can also be referred to as TD-2 or trade day -2, or D+2. The day-ahead process on that day produces advisory schedules, or D+2 schedules. Apologies. Sorry about that. The day-ahead market process on DA2 produces advisory schedules 2 days out of real time. The day-ahead process on DA1, otherwise known as TD-1 or the day ahead, produces your binding schedules, your financially binding schedules. And I've labeled the next day gas days on here as well. You see next day gas day 1 or GD1 ends on TD-2. Next day gas day 2 starts on TD-2 and runs through TD-1. Flows from next day gas day 1 are delivered at 7 a.m. on TD-1. Flows from next day gas day 2 are delivered at 7 a.m. in real time. This figure also points out when the ISO pulls an estimate of the gas price index for next day gas day 2, and when the intraday cycles occur. All right, let's go to the next slide. So section 4 of the paper focuses on informing fuel procurement. Most stakeholders during the working group process identified a need for accurate information in order to inform fuel procurement as the highest priority item that came out of the gas resource management working groups. So the ISO has actually already started to develop a new and more direct indicator of day-ahead schedules through a new market process, which I'll talk about. During the working group process, we also heard some stakeholders question the potential feasible value add of putting additional efforts into this area. So the issue paper describes stakeholder perspectives from prior efforts and why prior efforts ended up focusing more on bidding flexibility. It discusses how evolving market participant characteristics warrant revisiting these efforts now. And because we have this new process, the issue paper also identifies opportunities for improvement that didn't exist before. So we'll talk about those a little bit today. Michelle.
Yeah, so we got a question in the chat from Michelle Tovar Mora saying GD1 and GD2 beginning HE11, should that be HE7?
So trading for next day gas days 1 and 2 begin and end at 11 a.m. The flows are then delivered or active at 7 a.m. So next day gas day 1, trading ends at 11 a.m. on DA2. Then whatever is nominated during that trading cycle gets delivered the next day, DA1 at 7 a.m. scheduling.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Let's go to slide 9, or the next slide, I guess. Great. So I mentioned that the ISO has already begun to develop a new source of advisory information. Today, there are 2 distinct processes in the TD-2 timeframe that produce advisory schedules, and that's the 48-hour RUC, which is part of the ISM, the day-ahead market process, and the D+2 market run. These are 2 different things. They are functionally different. They have different processes. They start and finish at different times. They use somewhat different inputs and operate using different functions. And because of that, the information that they produce actually tells you something different. And so if you take nothing else away from today, it should be this concept. I've discovered a lot of confusion and conflation over this. I literally had to stalk someone from market operations to the parking lot to get clarity on what the differences are. So I'm going to go slowly through this. Let me know if you have questions as I go. The way I've labeled this is TD-2, TD-1, trade day. So TD-2, you have a day-ahead process, and it's going to run the IFM, or the IFM on TD-2. That's going to be the financially binding awards for real time the next day on TD-1. There might also be a 48-hour RUC. So that's going to use the IFM results from TD-2 and pretend that's real time tomorrow. So it uses those results as a proxy. It basically says this equals real time tomorrow. And if we assume that this equals real time tomorrow, we're going to be forecasting ahead another 24 hours. And that is the advisory results that come from the 48-hour RUC. So this tells you what the forecasted reliability needs are 2 days out, but doesn't necessarily indicate what the next day's binding schedules will be. That compared to the D+2. The D+2 is a totally separate market run. We start the D+2 after the day-ahead market process has already concluded. So the day-ahead market process concludes around 1 p.m., the D+2 concludes around 6 p.m. And the D+2 is specifically designed to forecast the next day's ISM results. I've also put on this graph, just for comparison, the suggestion that came out of the working group process, which I'm calling the D1.5, which is another run between 1 and 4 a.m. After the D+2, but before the day-ahead market runs. The D+1.5 doesn't exist today, but in a couple of slides, I'll talk about some of the potential challenges to developing that. Let's go to the next slide. So today, scheduling coordinators that have gas resources participating in the day-ahead market may receive this residual unit commitment advisory schedules from the 48-hour RUC. Scheduling coordinators are not receiving information from the separate D+2 today. We do provide D+2 information to gas pipeline companies. We send them volumetric gas burn information, both at an individual resource level and an aggregate level. We also, I think, publish AS from the D+2 on OASIS, but otherwise we do not provide information from the separate D+2 run today. Let's go to the next slide. But because the D+2 is better, we're moving towards that. Once EDAM goes live, the 48-hour RUC will actually no longer exist. Today, we don't run it every day. We only run it occasionally. So just like today, where we have a 48 to 168-hour RUC, after EDAM goes live, we'll instead be using the D+2 market run, which will include a multi-day lookout, D+2, D+3, D+4. And because this is a new source of information, the ISO recognizes that there's a need for more coordination and transparency around this process. So we'll be looking for your feedback and engagement to ensure that the D+2 advisory results are useful for informing gas procurement. And before I move on to talking about the inputs and where we're looking for your engagement on this, I do want to touch on the D+1.5. At a high level, the implementation list of this suggested market process looks significant. Any new stream of information would require a new business process in order for us to validate and publish it. We also today don't have much new information at this time. At least we don't have processes developed to produce the relevant information. For example, today we don't receive new forecasts until around 5:45 a.m., and that's in support of the day-ahead market process. So we would need to establish a new process to produce new forecasts, get new information from our vendors, get new gas price information, et cetera. So all of that becomes a pretty significant lift. And let's go to the next slide. So first, we'd like to prioritize taking a look at planned improvements using the D+2 and information like imbalance reserves that could benefit gas generators, making sure this information is useful and valuable to you. And the ISO is opening to develop this new market run, but we recommend in the near term at least focusing on this new D+2 process, making sure we can maximize the use of it and more clearly identify the limits of planned improvements. And that's going to require some operational experience once EDAM goes live and we start using the stream of information. Let's go to the next slide. So I am looking for a little bit of discussion here today. The comment template asks for feedback on, at a high level, the scope of areas that we might consider within the scope of this initiative in order to make sure market participants have confidence in using this new stream of D+2 market results in order to inform fuel procurement. So as a starting point, I've put 4 areas where we think gas resource management stakeholders could be plugged into. That includes inputs for modeling and accuracy, considerations around imbalance reserves and uncertainty, and how to represent market data. And I'm going to go through each of these briefly to talk about what they mean and then pause for some discussion. So in terms of inputs and modeling and assessment, the left hand of your screen, these reflect feedback from a lot of stakeholders that asked us for an assessment of the accuracy of these market results in the TD-2 timeframe. Doing an accuracy assessment may not be super straightforward for a number of reasons. First, we need a precise definition of accuracy. For example, accuracy with respect to what? Comparing D+2 to day ahead, comparing D+2 to real time, specifically with respect to thermal gas generators. And we're also looking for feedback to better understand how to produce an assessment that's meaningful for regional gas market participants, given that the day ahead today, for day ahead today, we basically use base schedules to represent LEAM entities. On the other side of the screen, we think it would be useful to talk about imbalance reserves and uncertainty, which I view as a sort of subcategory of market data representation. And the latter reflects feedback that we got from stakeholders requesting that the ISO provide additional information from the market run beyond just megawatt-hour advisory schedules. For example, some stakeholders recommend that the ISO provide scheduling coordinators with volumetric gas burn in addition to the megawatt schedules, and this is only something that we provide direct to gas companies today. So we're looking for what types of information would be helpful for you to understand the market results, what types of information would be helpful for you to do your procurement decisions. And I'm going to take a pause there and see if anyone has recommendations to expand the scope of what's on the slide or wants to discuss any of these questions.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in quite at this moment.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide. Maybe everyone's tired from price formation this morning. So that wraps up what we've done so far on informing fuel procurement. Some next steps that we envision we'll start to work on. The ISO has already begun to do this, but we plan to include some preliminary metrics to help illustrate the accuracy of the D+2 in the straw proposal, and hopefully to help you iterate and get the ball rolling on what an accuracy assessment should look like and how to better engage in D+2 coordination. At this time, we don't see any need for tariff changes in this area to affect the goals that we've discussed here. So all of this will likely conclude with some BPM changes.
Sylvie, we did just get a few hands raised if you want to take a moment to answer some questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, first up we have Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay Schlickman with NV Energy, and sorry, I was a little late with the hand raising. Could you go back to the previous slide? I was wondering, well, I was kind of hoping, could you explain how the imbalance reserve part actually improves, kind of helps the gas management issue? I'm really not following that, since it's the uncertainty from day ahead to the real-time market. I guess I'm just not quite sure how that would help improve the gas management.
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces here. First is the imbalance reserves product itself, which can help reduce instances when the market operator would conform load and when there would be increase the need for a residual unit commitment. And if there's more residual unit commitment, that can confound your ability to see what your ultimate schedule will be. The other piece of this is the uncertainty requirement, which we'll be publishing on OASIS. And that tells you, or at least indicates, what the potential error is between the day ahead and the FMM. And so we are thinking that this could provide an important piece of information for you to understand what your day ahead schedule might be. But we are looking for feedback to understand what the potential value of this is, and if we can provide information like it to help with gas procurement.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll think about it a bit more.
Next in the queue, we have Vijay.
Hey, this is Vijay Singh from PacifiCorp. Thanks, Sylvie, for the presentation. This is super helpful. Just a quick question on the bid sets used for the D2 assessment today. Are you saying here that it's only using prior bid sets, or is there functionality for scheduling coordinators to submit bids for future days to then, be used in the D+2 forecast?
Yeah, the thing you said before, today, for the D+2 market run, we use a bid set from 7 days prior. And this is different from what we do for the residual unit commitment run. So today, the 48-hour RUC uses historical bids if we don't have a bid in the system yet, but it also uses bids that have been submitted up until the point that we run it. I don't know that we've made any changes to the inputs and modeling assumptions with respect to what bid set we use in the D+2 today, which is why I've put it on the list here. We're open to feedback or input on whether or not we should consider this as part of this process.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like if, the stakeholders decided that they did want to submit bids for future days, there'd have to be a change in the D+2 assessment, like changing functionality.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have a question in the comments from Julie McCollum. She's raising concerns about RT load forecast for WEIM entities and asking if the ISO plans to address the accuracy of demand forecasts as part of this process, since that would inform gas needs.
It's definitely something that we can look at. And if you want to put that in comments, we can get our forecasting team to provide some data on that and talk about it.
Thanks. I'm not seeing any further questions at this time.
Well, I appreciate people picking up the things on that screen. We'd like to dive deeper into any of those topics. So let me know if you have questions on what's up for grabs in terms of discussion throughout the initiative. But we're hoping for feedback and ideas on whether or not we should pursue changes in any of those areas. Let's go to the next topic. All right. Accommodating gas cost variation in reference levels. So the next two topics we'll talk about, accommodating gas cost variation and also the accessibility of the cost adjustment process. Together, this is sections 5 to 6 in the issue paper. And these two sections combined are going to cover stakeholder identified problem statements and suggested approaches relating to improving the accuracy of the gas price index, or GPI, that the ISO uses to calculate reference levels. It considers ways to assess or support potential modifications to the reasonableness threshold, which was largely supported as a potential solution by stakeholders. It looks at accommodations for unique fuel supply arrangements and considers the timing and accessibility of the reference level change request process. While I know that there's a lot of valuable policy discussion around all of these topics, I thought for today it would be most useful for me to focus on some of the feasibility and IT and business process changes that are associated with the different stakeholder recommendations. And at the end, I put together a couple of slides for pros and cons where I invite you to jump in with your own policy-related or case-specific pros and cons. So let's go to the next slide. We've seen this before, but here I put some indicators to show you when the timelines are for various cost adjustment requests. A number of stakeholders suggested that as part of this process, we focus on the accuracy of information that the ISO uses to update reference levels. And the bottom line here is really that we use what's available at the time that it's needed, and updating the index price in ISO systems is a manual process. So if you're thinking about wanting to prioritize improvements in this area, what you have to understand is that any enhancement related to updates beyond what we do twice a day or gathering new sources or different sources of information would similarly be manual processes. These would add additional effort, but also time. And we need enough time to be able to get information, update our systems, report back to you, and then give you time to update your systems and update your decision-making. The other constraint here is that gas price information for intraday trading cycles will add a layer of complexity because our vendors, like ICE, do not similarly index intraday trading like they do for the next day gas phase. And what I've heard from ICE is that this is because a weighted average when trading is so illiquid and volatile, like during these intraday gas periods, isn't super helpful. So it's not as simple as pulling a single number from these vendors like we do when they publish next day gas indices. And this represents a challenge and some questions of both feasibility and policy that we'll talk about. Let's go to the next slide. So stakeholders identified a number of potential issues with the gas price index that we use in reference level calculations. For example, some stakeholders expressed concern about a lag in the gas price index being used, but the degree of impact that these issues might have and potential opportunities of improvement look very different if we're talking about the day ahead versus the real-time procedure. So the comment template is going to give you the opportunity to comment on each of these processes separately. And we'll be looking for feedback to more definitively scope and prioritize efforts or potential improvements to the accuracy of the gas price index being used. And I actually think it might be useful to flip to the previous slide and I'll walk through, the procedure for each. So for the day-ahead market, the ISO uses an approximation of gas day 2's gas price index. And this is because the final settled index isn't out before we have to run the day-ahead market. but we've found that gas day 1 isn't as good an indicator of costs in real time. And we've done some analysis that demonstrates that using GD2 for the full electric day is an improvement over GD1. For real time, the ISO uses the settled GD2 index and recalculates real-time reference levels in the evening before real time starts. The ISO will also recalculate the real-time reasonableness threshold in certain circumstances. For example, if we observe around 8:30 in the morning that prices in intraday 1 exceed 110% of the gas price index from GD2, we will update the reasonableness threshold. And I mentioned before why we don't use intraday gas price information by default or to calculate default values, primarily because it's difficult or infeasible. So intraday adjustments are limited by the reasonableness thresholds, and there's some policy concerns around that as well. Finally, I wanted to bring up Mondays since we did hear comments about that during the working group. The ISO uses a Monday-only gas price index when it's available and the weekend package otherwise. And this is because the ISO views Monday as the best indicator of the cost of fuel that's delivered on Mondays. And we don't use non-standard products for anything else. The goal here is to get the best indicator of cost being burned on a Monday, given the technology limitations or the limits on access to information that we have. So if you have an alternative approach or an alternative suggestion for Mondays, we'll be looking for additional information like, is there an assessment that we could do to show that that performs as an indicator? I think there's a question in the chat. Oh, talked about that, okay.
I think that was an old question. Oh,
Great.
we just got a hand raised though from Michelle.
Great.
Hey, Sylvie, this is Michelle, LADP. The timeline here for the next day, gas day 1, and the beginning of gas day 2, that's throwing me off a little bit because it seems like we're mixing the scheduling for day ahead time frame versus the actual gas day. Gas day 1 really starts at 0800 or ends. Gas day 1 ends at 0700, and gas day 2 in this example would actually begin at our ending 8.
Right. I think I'm just trying to establish a way to talk about this here. So when I refer to next day gas days 1 and 2, I'm really referring to this section of trading when you trade and you submit your nominations. And then when I talk about when flows are active, I'll say next day gas day 2, flows are active at 7 a.m. in real time. And I'm just doing it this way because I need a convention to talk about it. Otherwise, it gets really complicated.
Okay. I just, like, looking at this, I would just hate for people to misinterpret that you have up to hour ending 11 to procure, because typically if you're trying to lock in those schedules on day ahead, although the gas day starts at hour ending 8, you by 0600 or 0700, depending on where you're at, you won't be able to procure and lock in on the financials the index price.
I hear you. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to show it here. So you could see that trading for next day gas day 2 ends at 11 on DA1, and then flow starts the next day. If there's different words or better convention that you think would be more clear, let me know.
Okay, we'll go ahead and look over this and then provide some comments.
Great. Thanks, Michelle.
And very nice visuals, by the way.
Glorified graphic designer. All right.
And then not seeing any other questions at this time.
Well, let's go to the next slide. I just went over this. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we use, I think I see a comment.
Yeah, we just got a question from Julie
Yeah,
saying,
we can talk about
what makes incorporating intraday gas price changes infeasible? Is it because of the manual process and vendor limitations? Are there options for automation in the future?
We love options for automation. Let's go back 2 slides. Okay, so we normally recalculate reference levels twice a day. One of them is where that big blue box says, where it says 8 a.m. deadline, and the ISO calculates an estimate of GPI. So around between 8 and 9 a.m., our market analysis team is doing stuff to update gas price information and recalculate reference levels. And then we do it again later in the evening. So there's 2 times a day where we have an established business process. If we want to do it at a different time of day, we would need to establish a new business process. So that's not an infeasibility, but it does take time and costs and other things. The next piece is because of vendor limitations. Our vendors don't necessarily provide us with a number. Instead, there's data. So for the next day gas day, we can pull an index value from our vendors, and that's going to tell us what the weighted average of those trades are. That value doesn't exist for these intraday cycles, so we'd have to do some sort of calculation, and that might also require some policy questions around what the weighted average during an intraday cycle means, and how we want to calculate that. Yeah, so those are the major considerations here.
Great, thanks. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Okay. And I'll talk about how we solve this problem in one more slide. But the ISO uses the GPI to calculate reference levels. These are cost-based values, which means they're supposed to only reflect the direct cost of starting up, staying at min load, and providing incremental energy. There's 2 default values. The default energy bid serves as a mitigation floor when the ISO detects local market power. And note that I call this mitigation floor because if a resource is mitigated or the resource is identified as being in a congested area, it may not be mitigated, or it might be mitigated down to a value above the DEV, but never lower than. And then we use commitment cost calculations to more or less validate startup and min load bids before sending them to the market. So policy around all of these things really reflects this balance between wanting to capture costs accurately, but also needing to balance the feasibility and administrative effort of doing so. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. Before I jump into some of the functionality and logistics, let me start out with a few principles. The reference level change request process is what helps us facilitate cost adjustments, and it's intended to support least cost dispatch and market efficiency. One of the ways that it does that is that it makes it easier for the ISO to get resource-specific and more timely information about resource costs, and this can help support market efficiency. The process is intended to incentivize market participants to come to the table and give us this information, and it doubles as an intentional checkpoint that that facilitates auditing and monitoring. The pre-market adjustment process might be limited because it's intended to protect against speculative behavior and strategic bidding. For example, the automated process validates requested cost adjustments against the reasonableness thresholds, which we'll talk about. And it would adjust requested values above the reasonableness thresholds at the reasonableness thresholds. Manual requests are limited by what supporting documentation is available and when. But any costs that are requested through this process and not validated would be eligible for cost recovery through a streamlined aftermarket process. The issue paper goes through all of this in a lot of detail, just in case you have any questions about it. but this slide is really intended to reflect the intent behind the design. So let's go to the next slide. Before I explain this, I want to note that we don't have any specified or tariff-defined expectations around whether you use the automated or the manual process given your use case or situation, but I find it helpful to talk about potential use cases in order to understand why this process is designed the way that it is and better hone in on where enhancements would be the most valuable. So I really like to think of each of these columns or steps as how your costs correlate with your GPI. So the default value here, your default calculation, includes a 10% multiplier. So this works when your costs have a strong correlation with the GPI in your reference levels. The reasonableness threshold is there when a resource's specific costs correlate weakly. And this is intended to acknowledge volatility. Volatility doesn't impact all resources equally or predictably or all the time. So this process design acknowledges those differences in impacts, but the fact that it can happen and to varying degrees. Finally, there's a manual process. And this reflects the possibility that a resource's costs don't correlate at all with the GPI in their reference levels. And through the manual process, the ISO will receive specific cost information from the resource and will recalculate all reference levels, default calculation, and the reasonableness threshold using the costs approved through this process. So the reasonableness threshold and the manual process are two pre-market options for cost adjustments when your costs don't correlate well with the gas price index that we use. The final column here is the streamlined after cost recovery. This doesn't appear on the same graph in the issue paper, but I've gotten questions about it. So I just wanted to note that compared to other procedural options, this aftermarket cost recovery process that's married to the pre-market process is streamlined compared to those other procedural options. So this provides the incentive for you to use this process even if it doesn't reflect all of the costs that you've requested. So let's go to the next slide. And here maybe I'll be able to answer some of Julie's questions a little bit better. So the reference level change request process does not directly account for the cost of fuel procured intraday. So instead, what we do is we use the reasonableness threshold. The reasonableness threshold is intended to represent the range within which the ISO and stakeholders, through a previous policy process, determined automatic validation without needing documentation ahead of time is reasonable. The reasonableness threshold is based on GD2, so GD2 is basically an anchor for this value because we have it, and we understand that most gas procured for real time is nominated and procured during GD2. The reasonableness threshold is intended to cover most variation between gas prices in GD2 and the intraday cycles. And the analysis that supports the reasonableness threshold as it is today looked at these differences between GD2 and real time. And it also purposely excluded some outliers, and there's examples of that in the appendix, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. There's also another sort of subset of processes that we have to update the reasonableness threshold in real time. And this is intended for exceptional circumstances based on something the ISO can observe. So for instance, we have a same-day gas update. When the ISO observes gas prices during intraday 1 exceed 110% of GD2, we will update the reasonableness threshold. If we receive 3 or more manual requests at a given gas hub, we may recalculate the reasonableness threshold for all resources mapped to that gas hub. And if we observe a resource's actual costs are systematically greater than the GPI in their reference levels, we may update the reasonableness threshold for that resource. And this sort of second section of exceptional circumstances is why there's a lot of call-outs in the issue paper and questions in the comment template that are intended to help us better characterize when the issues you're facing are occurring and what we, the ISO, might be able to observe that could tip us off to the need for a higher threshold. So let's go to the next slide. A lot of the prompts in the comment template reflect these questions, and we're seeking stakeholder feedback to inform what the potential value and feasibility of pursuing these different approaches within the policy development process would be. For example, we'll be looking for stakeholder input on what methodology would most appropriately assess and determine the scalar value that defines the reasonableness threshold. And I envision that we will have a lot more discussion on assessment methods once the straw proposal comes out, if this is the direction that the group agrees on. So I didn't plan specifically to go into this today, but there are a couple of examples in the appendix of the statistical methodology that we've used in the past to support the reasonableness threshold value. And there's lots of examples in the issue paper that you can use and draw off of for your comments. Some questions that you might answer, if this is helpful, is what metrics, for instance, percentage trade volume, number of outliers, or dollar degree of impact would be useful to assess quote unquote reasonableness. And we're also looking for feedback on how this process might accommodate differences between gas hubs. For instance, what a reasonable percentage is for one gas hub might have a different impact elsewhere. In terms of exceptional circumstances, each of these three questions really gets to the same idea. They're just different ways to ask it. Under what specific conditions or scenarios do sudden price spikes occur? Under what specific conditions or scenarios is volatility in intradays 2 and 3 not related to volatility between gas day 1 and intraday 1? And we're interested in this because we do have this adjustment based on intraday 1, but the adjustment does not exist for intraday 2 and 3, and we're wondering how often that's a problem and in what condition that might be a problem. And more broadly, we're looking for input or ideas on what predictive methods might be used to make changes to the reasonableness threshold more proactively. I'm going to stop there. Comments, ideas, questions about your assignment so far?
I'm not seeing any other questions coming in quite yet.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So we are broadly seeking feedback to identify what approach or approaches would be most valuable for us to focus on as a group in the policy development process. And I've mentioned before that I'm certain none of you want a 400-page straw proposal. So I'm going to kick things off here with a high-level discussion of some pros and cons. Each of the suggested approaches that are listed in the issue paper and that we heard from stakeholders may have different pros and cons that depend on different use cases. So I welcome you to jump in, provide context and additional considerations. And we're going to be looking for feedback in that area to identify which of these tools, if any, best address the problems that you've described, how to assess these tools, and how they can be improved. And before we jump into that comparison, I wanted to throw an example in here. If we go to the next slide. So I really like this example because it highlights how different solutions that we've heard from stakeholders are more or less appropriate for different problems. Most of what we heard from the stakeholder community is concerned about prices suddenly increasing. This slide has a different problem. This slide shows you an example where a problem arises when prices go down significantly between GD1 and GD2. So here, when prices go down significantly, you see that the reference levels for hours ending in 1 through 7 will underestimate costs for those hours because we're using GD2 as the anchor for reference levels. Whereas if prices go up day over day between GD1 and GD2, your reference levels will overestimate costs for gas that's flowing in HE 1 through 7. So policy today will either over or underestimate costs for 1/3 of the real-time trade day. And it actually underestimates costs when prices go down. So the ISO does not currently see systematic error, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a significant problem when prices go down in GD2. We understand from stakeholders that losses can be significant if your reference levels underestimate your costs. And even if that evens out over time, market participants may not have the ability to smooth those differences over time. So we're looking for feedback to help justify some of the potential changes associated with stakeholder recommendations. So if we continue with this example, one of the potential solutions is to increase the reasonableness threshold. And this would be a less efficient outcome than today and significantly less efficient than using the right price. Using the right price would deliver better overall market outcomes, but is significantly more difficult in terms of our technical ability to implement it. So we're looking for feedback to really define the precise problem and how big it is. And once we have a straw proposal, we can think about if the solution has policy trade-offs, and if it does, how to backstop those, or if the solution is technically significant, how do we justify it? And this example is in the issue paper. Okay, let's continue on. So I'll go through these pros and cons. These are really based on the ISO's prior experience in policy development initiatives, feedback from our IT and implementation teams, and working group feedback. But I'll be looking to this group to hear more about the context, additional pros and cons, or other considerations that we should think about. So the first sort of bucket of potential areas for improvement would be modifying the gas price index that we use in reference levels. The pro of focusing on this approach is that improved accuracy can reduce the need for cost adjustments. And then because we're reflecting better costs in the market, that better reflects sudden changes in gas market conditions into the electric market, giving us better outcomes. The con of pursuing this approach is that the ISO may not have access to additional information, and updates would require meaningful IT and business process changes. Any questions or thoughts about that so far?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet.
All right, let's go to the next. So the next bucket of potential approaches would be modifications to the reasonableness threshold or modifications to the reasonableness threshold in exceptional circumstances. So focusing on the reasonableness thresholds, the pro of pursuing enhancements in this area is that this is a tool that allows for proactive adjustments. It's really intended to facilitate cost adjustments for expected costs as well as actual costs. but it also provides a checkpoint for monitoring and can reduce the need to make manual adjustments. The con of this approach is that we can't practically capture all costs all of the time. Even if we increase the reasonableness threshold, it's still likely that there will be costs above it at some point. So this policy tool has diminishing returns, so to speak. Increasing the reasonableness thresholds also increases the potential for inflated cost requests to clear the market, and those inappropriate costs can't be undone. While we can penalize resources for requesting costs without a valid basis, we can't undo the market. The second bucket here is just considering reasonableness threshold adjustments in exceptional circumstances. The benefit of this approach is that it would reduce reliance on manual adjustments, but we wouldn't be making broad modifications to the reasonableness threshold, and therefore we can minimize the cons associated with that approach. The con with this approach is that triggers are manual, and they are also based on observations. So recall the triggers that I named before include observations of gas prices during intraday 1, seeing manual requests come in, and observing what happens in the aftermarket process. So this isn't necessarily proactive, although I personally find the 3 manual requests to be an interesting version on this because we use that to indicate that there might be a problem, even if we haven't observed it yet. Any questions there?
I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay. Let's go to the next. We got a lot of stakeholder recommendations on how we might modify the reference level change request process itself, including considerations of the timeline and the functionality. So the pros for thinking about these types of changes is that it has the potential to improve the ISO's access to timely gas cost information, specifically more accurate resource-specific gas cost information. And this improves market efficiency. The con of spending time focusing on this approach is that it doesn't actually reduce the need for cost adjustments and doesn't necessarily get to the core problem if your organization is facing reference levels that are wrong most of the time. Modifications in this area might create more opportunities for speculative behavior and likely would require some significant IT and business process changes. So they're a big lift. Let's go to the next slide. The final bucket of potential approaches would be to pivot a little bit and think less about the gas prices themselves and more about the overall reference level calculations. Today, we offer resource-specific negotiated and customized parameters, and we're going to be looking for feedback on whether you've used this as a tool or if you think it could be valuable or modified to be easier to use or more specific to your organization's needs. The pro of this area is that using this as a tool can reduce specific resources' reliance on cost adjustments to accommodate error, or in other words, to minimize or eliminate systematic differences between your costs and the GPI by establishing a resource-specific equilibrium. So the goal here is to ensure your reference level calculations are only off by a little in either direction, but even out. The cons of using this approach is that these modifications tend to be static and backward-looking. These types of changes are typically supported by historical data. And we've heard from a lot of stakeholders that we're looking at anticipated changes in gas markets and increasing volatility. So this may not fit the bill, and the upfront process can be burdensome for market participants that choose this option. A version of this is coming up with a standard blended fuel region methodology. The pro of this approach is that it offers resources with a pre-approved alternative to the resource-specific negotiated and customized parameters, and that reduces the need to go through this burdensome process. It still would be backward and static, and it would require broad stakeholder engagement. It would require this group to engage in developing some sort of methodology, and may still over or underestimate a specific resource's costs over time. Some of the suggestions that we got in the working group process was to consider a methodology that uses the highest of multiple hub values, or potentially a weighted average or blended fuel region. The issue paper goes through the challenges that we encountered previously when trying to implement a blended fuel region, and one of them was that we would have to use, we would look at an annual aggregate fuel costs. We couldn't update it more often than once a year, and this was we didn't hear a lot of support for something that's static. So on this topic in particular, we are looking for feedback on whether there's a demand for a sort of standardized blended fuel region methodology, given those potential limitations, given that we can't update this all the time. So I'll pause there before moving on to the next topic and see if anyone wants to discuss any of these. We've got a little time.
I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions in the chat at this moment.
All right. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm hoping that the way I've outlined these was a helpful exercise for you to prepare your comments and think about what the working group should focus on moving forward. Again, we're looking for your feedback on which of these approaches would specifically would be most appropriate for the problems that you're facing, and suggestions on how to improve them if necessary. But we also have a number of next steps based on feedback that we've already gotten to date. During the working group process, we presented a regional gas hub analysis, and we plan on iterating on that. The plan is to use that as a basis and either expand it or go in a different direction, and ultimately align on an appropriate gas scalar or assessment methodology if that's the direction the working groups decide to go in. We'll also be considering other types of reference level modifications that I've talked about in these slides, and all of this will conclude with potential tariff changes. Okay. Gonna keep going.
We did just get another question in from the chat if you wanted to hear it at this time. Okay,
sure.
So it's Julie McCollum saying, quote, there's a significant focus on D+2 timeline for gas procurement, while intraday constraints such as OFOs were a primary focus when this working group began. Pipeline penalties still represent the largest area of financial exposure for many market participants. Will this working group be revisiting the topic of OFOs? End quote.
I will answer that in two ways. First, I put significant focus on the D+2 timeline because during the working group process, when we asked for input on prioritization, we heard overwhelmingly that the need for information in the D+2 timeline was the highest priority. So that's really what we thought about a lot during that working group process, and then also we did internally. But because at this point, the work in that area won't be as significant a lift, we can now think about things like OFOs, and the next part of my presentation will discuss that.
Great, thanks. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this moment.
Great. And this is a good opportunity to just plug that I understand prioritization may have shifted around and the amount of work that it's going to take in each of these areas will hopefully have crystallized given what's in the issue paper. So there's a question in there that asks, basically it asks you to prioritize what areas you'd like to focus on next. So Julie, if you'd like to plug using the working groups to continue to think about OFOs, we welcome that feedback. So let's go on to the next slide. All right. Section 7 of the issue paper is dedicated to managing gas burn limitations. And there are a couple of pieces to this puzzle. First, we got some stakeholder requests that the ISO should provide an overview of gas constraint nomograms. So the issue paper provides an overview of what these are, how they're activated, and how they support reliability without distorting market outcomes. Gas constraint nomograms are a tool that we have today, and it's an important tool in these ISO's toolbox per se, but the complexities around them really limit their use to very specific situations, which I'll talk about, and may not align with what we heard the issues were during the gas resource management working group process. Stakeholders also suggested that the ISO and stakeholders collectively explore functionality that could help improve market efficiency with respect to gas system limitations. So the issue paper provides some specifics and lessons learned from prior stakeholder discussions on this issue, and identifies some primary guidelines and considerations if we want to come up with policy development in this area. Let's go to the next slide. So a crash course in nomograms. A gas constraint nomogram suppresses LMPs in the constrained area. And this is in order to make a gas generator in that area appear uneconomic and shift dispatch elsewhere. It's designed so that the cost of the constraint does not show up in prices to settle demand. And this is how we are able to manage reliability without distorting market outcomes. This is specifically a tool that we use to support reliability, but it's really impractical for regular use for a number of reasons. One is that activating a gas constraint nomogram is a manual process, and it requires coordination between the ISO, the BA, the gas system pipeline, and the resources. We also make a number of simplifying assumptions in order to make it work, but that can also reduce precision. And if we're hearing from the working group that what we're looking for is an increase in accuracy or efficiency, this may not be the perfect tool there. It also requires significant computational resources, so we can't do this for everyone all the time. We can't do it every day. And the ISO puts a lot of work into monitoring and supporting this to make sure it doesn't impact market performance. Let's go to the next slide. So we did hear from stakeholders during the working group process that gas nomograms may not fit the bill for the issues that they're facing. And we heard that one of the goals of the policy initiative should be to explore new methods that support efficient gas burn limitation management. Stakeholders cited concerns with efficiency and economic management. We didn't explicitly hear any concerns about reliability, but please let us know if the gas burn limitations you're facing pose a reliability risk. Stakeholders described experiencing gas system limitations regularly or hourly, which is another reason why the gas constraint nomogram may not fit the bill here. And some stakeholders suggested an approach that would allow resources to reflect the cost of staying within nominations and managing pipeline restrictions. And there's two things that I want to note there. One is that there are explicit rules where we can't incorporate the penalty cost of an OFO within prices or allow you to recover those in costs. And the other is that this is a very different idea from a gas nomogram that suppresses LMPs and then does not reflect those any costs when settling demand. So what we've heard from stakeholders we understand to be different from a nomogram, but we want to make sure that if it's useful and necessary, regional balancing authority areas have the ability to take advantage of that as a tool. So as a next step for the ISO, we are going to provide some guidelines for regional balancing authorities in case you want to explore and initiate gas nomogram development. Let's go to the next slide. So I've identified some key guidelines here. This reflects, I guess, the gist of what regulators have responded, how regulators have responded to previous ISO efforts to implement nomograms and other methods of managing gas constraints. So these are the basic expectations that we should expect to meet if we want to bring something to FERC to manage gas system limitations. One, whatever we develop must not negatively impact gas system reliability. Two, it needs to be transparent. So the ISO needs to have access to the relevant information to implement something and to monitor it. Previous attempts at figuring out how to do this have run into challenges where the only information available to the ISO came through its market participants. The ISO is going to need a direct stream of information, say, from the gas pipeline, which doesn't exist today. Finally, equity. And I heard this from a lot of stakeholders already during the working group, where whatever solution we should come up with should impact all market participants fairly. And I welcome you to comment and iterate on these as we think about policy development in this area. So before I go on, we are looking for stakeholder feedback on the challenges and opportunities that are specific to you today. The issue paper has a couple of, I guess, case studies, so to speak, of when we've tried to implement opportunity costs or adders in order to manage gas system limitations. And what's described may not be the same thing as what you have in mind. So it'd be useful to know if what we've put in the issue paper is similar or different from what you're experiencing. Let's go to the next slide. So two of the challenges that we've identified before. First is that the ISO does not have consistent or timely access to gas system information. For instance, we don't have a pipeline of data that tells us volumetric limitations. And we also don't always know when you get notifications or what those notifications mean. And because of this, it's hard to ensure reliability and it's hard to meet those transparency standards. We also don't know how individual resources might be situated. And so there's an equity impact there if we don't have enough or clear access to information. The second challenge that we've identified previously is that there are differences in gas pipeline policies across the West. Different gas pipelines have different definitions of OFOs, different rules about the timing of notifications, associated penalties, and what they mean. So we don't always know what the expected resource behavior is as a result of these notifications, even if we knew that you got one. So this makes it challenging for us to develop something that we can guarantee won't have impacts to reliability, has full transparency, and respects the principle of equity. Let's go to the next slide. So a couple of next steps that we have already identified based on feedback to date. The ISO is going to develop guidelines for gas constraint nomograms in case there are BAs in the EIM or EDAM that would like to consider developing one. And we plan to have this in the straw proposal or an upcoming paper. The ISO is also actively participating in ongoing processes like FERC gas electric coordination efforts, and we're representing your interests there. And we've been able to work with our operators on plugging what we've heard in working groups. Finally, one of our goals is to improve access to timely gas system information and to hear more, understand better regional gas pipeline policies. And we're also looking for stakeholder feedback in this area. What information should the ISO have in order to develop policy in this area, and how can you help us point toward the right direction? Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions coming in right now.
Well, that's all I have for today. I think it makes sense to maybe wrap up then. I know that a lot of you have been in working groups all day. So let's go to the next slide and just talk about next steps. Already posted the comment template. It is long. One of my coworkers earlier today joked that you should all get 100 points just for signing your names. Comments are due March 11th, so you have plenty of time. You don't need to answer all of the questions, just the ones that are applicable to you and you think will deliver value. We're also starting to think about presentations. The next opportunity to present will be after comments are due, but before the straw proposal. So if you have specific ideas on prioritization, let us know if you'd like to present. And then after the straw proposal comes out, we're going to be looking for stakeholder presentations or ideas on policy and analysis. And that's it.
Great, thanks, Sylvie. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in either. So next, I just have a quick announcement. For insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. And with that, we'd like to thank you all so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's conference, and thank you for using Inteller Services. Your conference has ended, and you may disconnect.